Imagine a decade when ghosts whispered from film reels and studios trembled at what they had unleashed. The 1970s birthed some of the most chilling supernatural tales ever told, yet many were lost when the VHS boom swallowed them whole. They vanished from shelves and memories alike. Tonight, we resurrect those haunted films that time itself tried to bury. Number 15, The Legend of Hell House, 1973. When it hit theaters, this film was hailed as Britain's answer to The Haunting, but far more violent and sinister. Adapted from Richard Matheson's novel, it told of a team of scientists and mediums trapped in the notorious Belasco mansion, seeking proof of life after death. Inside, they faced invisible assaults, psychic terror, and a house that fed on fear itself. What made The Legend of Hell House so unnerving was its blend of cold science and spiritual horror. Unlike the Gothic castles of earlier decades, this was clinical psychological terror. Critics admired its intelligence, yet television censors refused to rebroadcast it due to scenes of possession and cruelty deemed too disturbing for home viewing. When VHS arrived, its darker tone led distributors to favor flashier American titles instead. Behind the scenes, the production was tense. Director John Hove clashed with executives who wanted more gore, while Matheson fought to keep his cerebral vision intact. Pamela Franklin's breakdown scene was so convincing that audiences believed she had suffered a real mental collapse. The film's eerie synthesizer score later influenced countless haunted house movies. By the time horror fans rediscovered it in the DVD era, it had already become a ghost in cinema history. Today, The Legend of Hell House stands as a warning of how subtle fear was replaced by spectacle, and how silence on tape can be scarier than screams. Number 14. The Sentinel, 1977. Released in the late 70s, this chilling supernatural thriller was promoted as the next Exorcist, yet it vanished almost immediately after its debut. The film followed a young model who moves into a Brooklyn apartment building only to learn it sits at the gateway to hell itself. The tenants are damned souls disguised as the living, and the blind priest upstairs guards the portal. Critics called it blasphemous and unsettling. Church groups demanded it be pulled from theaters, claiming it mocked faith. Some European territories banned it outright for its use of real, disfigured extras in its climax. The imagery was so extreme that even VHS rental chains refused to stock it, fearing backlash from religious communities. Behind closed doors, Universal executives panicked. Director Michael Winner pushed boundaries with practical effects, showing demons not as monsters, but as malformed humans. The controversy drowned its artistry. Even cast members like Burgess Meredith distanced themselves from the project, fearing career damage. Yet beneath the scandal lies one of the oddest, most atmospheric New York horror films ever made. The claustrophobic apartment, the decaying wallpaper, the relentless bells tolling from the church next door all paint a portrait of urban damnation. The Sentinel disappeared when sanitized cable horror took over, but its spirit never died. Watch it today, and you'll understand why some doors in cinema should never have been opened. Number 13. Burnt Offerings, 1976. When this film premiered, audiences expected another haunted mansion yarn. What they got was a slow psychological collapse that felt too real. Burnt Offerings starred Oliver Reed and Karen Black as a couple who rent a sprawling country estate for the summer, only to find that the house itself demands human vitality to stay alive. The film was a commercial success at first, yet its pace and atmosphere confused mainstream viewers. Critics dismissed it as old-fashioned in an era racing toward slashers. When home video arrived, distributors overlooked it in favor of bloodier titles, leaving its quiet dread to fade. Some scenes, particularly those showing the house feeding on the family's sanity, were edited for television, reducing its power and mystery. Behind the camera, tensions flared. Director Dan Curtis, known for Dark Shadows, insisted on keeping the story ambiguous. He wanted viewers to wonder if the evil was supernatural or psychological. Oliver Reed reportedly terrified the crew with his intense method approach, blurring fiction and reality. During one take, his rage smashed a real door, not a prop. Decades later, Burnt Offerings became a blueprint for modern haunted house films like The Shining. Its influence is everywhere, yet few remember the original. Buried by the VHS era, it lingered like a ghost, waiting for new technology to resurrect it. Watching it now feels like unlocking a cursed memory, one that breathes again after years in the dark. Number 12. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. When this eerie, low-budget film emerged, critics dismissed it as too strange to succeed. But those who saw it never forgot its haunting mood. The story followed Jessica, a fragile woman recently released from a mental institution who retreats to a quiet farmhouse hoping for peace. Instead, she finds whispers in the water shadows in the orchard and a mysterious girl who might be undead. Unlike the screaming horror of its time, this movie relied on atmosphere and silence. Every frame felt damp with dread, every echo suggested madness. Viewers were unsure whether Jessica was witnessing ghosts or descending again into insanity. This ambiguity frightened studio marketers who struggled to promote it. Drive-in theaters rejected it, and when the VHS boom began, its subtle terror was lost among flashier titles with louder monsters. Behind the scenes, the production was grueling. Director John Hancock worked with a shoestring budget and unpredictable weather in rural Connecticut. Zora Lampert's performance was so vulnerable that crew members often stopped filming just to comfort her. Rumors circulated that the isolated set truly was haunted, a myth that only deepened the film's legend. For decades, the film was nearly impossible to find. But when rediscovered by horror scholars, it became recognized as one of the first psychological ghost stories of the modern age. It proved that horror could whisper instead of scream. Let's Scare Jessica to Death reminds us that sometimes the quietest fear lingers the longest. Number 11. The Changeling, 1979. In the closing years of the decade came one of cinema's most elegant ghost stories. The Changeling starred George C. Scott as a composer, mourning his family, who rents a grand old mansion in Seattle, only to uncover the spirit of a murdered child. The film won international awards, yet vanished quickly from home video shelves. Its atmosphere was impeccable. The rattling wheelchair, the echo of footsteps in empty halls, the mysterious banging every morning at 6:37. Critics praised it as restrained and intelligent, but audiences chasing slashers ignored its slow burn. When VHS distributors chose titles, they favored gore over grief, leaving this masterpiece to collect dust. The film's power came from its real emotional anchor. Scott's raw performance mirrored his own grief after personal tragedy, lending authenticity to every scene. Director Peter Medak's precise framing turned the house into a breathing entity. During production, strange occurrences were reported. Lights flickered without reason. Equipment moved overnight. Crew members swore they heard a child crying. Though largely forgotten in the VHS age, The Changeling influenced generations of supernatural cinema from The Others to The Sixth Sense. It showed that true terror lies not in blood, but in sorrow. Watching it now feels like communing with a lost soul, one that never stopped knocking for recognition. Number 10. The Mephisto Waltz, 1971. Released at the dawn of the decade, this film tried to ride the wave of satanic thrillers launched by Rosemary's Baby. It starred Alan Alda as a pianist whose life unravels after a dying virtuoso transfers his soul into Alda's body. What followed was a surreal tale of possession music and damnation wrapped in high society luxury. Critics found it too intellectual for mainstream horror. Its dream sequences and occult symbolism baffled audiences who expected simple scares. When the VHS boom arrived, studios considered it too dated and cerebral to market. Many copies were never converted from film reels at all. For years, it existed only in fading television prints and bootleg tapes. Behind the scenes, tension brewed. Director Paul Wendkos fought with studio heads over its ambiguous ending. Alan Alda later admitted he struggled with the tone torn between psychological drama and pure horror. The haunting piano score by Jerry Goldsmith was nearly cut to shorten runtime, but was saved after test audiences reacted strongly to its beauty. The Mephisto Waltz was too refined for drive-ins and too dark for art houses. Its limbo mirrored the fate of its protagonist, forever trapped between worlds. Rediscovered decades later, it stands as a chilling metaphor for ambition and the price of genius. The VHS era buried it, but digital restoration finally let it play its cursed melody once more. Number 9. The Car, 1977. When The Car roared into theaters, it was marketed as Jaws on wheels. Critics laughed. Audiences were baffled. But those who looked closer saw something darker than a killer vehicle. They saw the 1970s fear of industrial power gone mad. The story followed a possessed black sedan terrorizing a desert town, mowing down anyone in its path, while its origins remained unholy and unexplained. Unlike typical horror, the car never showed its driver. The windshield was tinted, the engine sounded demonic, and the camera angles made it seem alive. Some claimed it represented the devil, others thought it was government technology gone rogue. When it hit, VHS distributors avoided it, believing audiences preferred slashers over metaphysical terror. Its box art was toned down, and it vanished from rental racks within months. Behind the camera, the desert shoot nearly broke the crew. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. The stunt driver barely survived a fiery crash that left the real car scorched. Director Elliot Silverstein insisted the vehicle never be shown with headlights off to preserve its menace. The eerie score and the biblical undertones gave the film an apocalyptic edge that critics failed to grasp. Years later, Quentin Tarantino and George Miller cited The Car as an influence for vehicular horror like Duel and Mad Max. Yet for decades, it was forgotten under dust and melted VHS labels. Watching it today, one feels the dread of machinery without mercy. The Car reminds us that evil does not always wear a face. Sometimes it has 4 wheels. Number 8. Messiah of Evil, 1973. Messiah of Evil was never meant to disappear. It was a visionary nightmare, blending Lovecraftian dread with surreal California decay. The story centered on a woman searching for her missing father in a seaside town where residents become possessed under the light of a blood-red moon. Its painterly visuals and haunting sound design made it one of the most unique horror films of its era. But distribution chaos doomed it. Producers re-edited the film without the director's approval, releasing multiple incomplete cuts. Critics dismissed it as incoherent, while others called it genius. When VHS arrived, no definitive version existed. Low-quality transfers circulated under different titles, like Dead People or Return of the Living Dead, confusing collectors and burying its legacy. Behind the scenes, husband and wife filmmakers Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, who later wrote American Graffiti and Indiana Jones, were devastated by studio meddling. Their original script was far more philosophical about isolation and decay in post-Vietnam America. Crew members recalled nights when the fog on set was so thick, actors vanished mid-scene, leaving only footsteps on wet sand. Rediscovered decades later in restored prints, Messiah of Evil became a cult revelation. Modern audiences now see its hypnotic pacing and visual poetry as prophetic of future art house horror, like it follows. The VHS era may have buried it, but the digital age resurrected it as one of the most atmospheric nightmares ever filmed. Number 7. The Entity, 1980. Though officially released in the early 80s, The Entity was a product of the haunted late 1970s. Based on real psychological studies, it followed a single mother tormented by an unseen force that defied science and faith alike. The story blurred lines between possession trauma and government experiment, creating a film that terrified both audiences and psychologists. Its realism was the problem. The film's depiction of supernatural attack was so intense that several countries refused classification. When VHS distributors sought family-friendly horror for the shelves, they left this one behind. It circulated only through bootlegs in faded print quality that dulled its impact. Yet those who saw it never forgot its power. Barbara Hershey delivered one of the most fearless performances of her career, channeling raw terror and disbelief. Director Sidney J. Furie used innovative sound techniques, making walls throb and air vibrate with invisible menace. Even hardened crew members refused to work night shifts after strange noises echoed on set. The Entity's disappearance was almost deliberate. Some claimed it touched too closely on real experiments the U.S. government preferred forgotten. Others said audiences simply could not handle horror grounded in reality. When rediscovered decades later, it stood as one of the most psychologically devastating supernatural tales ever made. The VHS era might have buried it, but whispers of its energy still haunt late-night broadcasts. Number 6. The Wicker Man, 1973. When The Wicker Man first premiered in Britain, it was hailed by some as genius and dismissed by others as blasphemy. The story of a devout police officer who travels to a remote Scottish island to investigate a missing girl only to uncover a pagan cult preparing a fiery ritual was unlike any horror film of its time. It mixed folk music, ritual dread, and erotic symbolism in ways that unsettled censors. British Lion Films panicked. Executives slashed the runtime by more than 20 minutes, removing critical scenes of religion and sacrifice. The original negatives were reportedly buried under a motorway during studio storage transfers. When VHS arrived, only the butchered version survived. Critics found it confusing, and audiences ignored it. The film became a rumor whispered among cinephiles as the greatest horror film nobody had seen. Behind the scenes, tensions ran high. Christopher Lee, who played Lord Summerisle, considered it his best performance and personally financed promotional screenings when the studio refused. Edward Woodward endured freezing conditions during the final bonfire scene, refusing stunt doubles for authenticity. Director Robin Hardy's vision of faith versus nature clashed violently with commercial interests. Decades later, the lost footage resurfaced in a rusted canister, restoring The Wicker Man to its original brilliance. What had been a mutilated curiosity became a cult masterpiece, inspiring generations of folk horror. Buried by censorship, resurrected by obsession, it stands as a reminder that even film reels can rise again from the ashes. Number 5. The Tenant, 1976. Roman Polanski's The Tenant closed his informal apartment trilogy with one of the most disturbing portraits of paranoia ever filmed. It told of a timid man who rents an apartment in Paris and slowly begins to believe the previous tenant is taking over his identity from beyond the grave. What made it haunting was not ghosts, but the erosion of the self. When it debuted, critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece of psychological horror, others condemned it as nihilistic and indecent. The film's tone was bleak even for the 70s. By the time VHS took over, distributors avoided titles without gore or easy marketing hooks. The Tenant's slow descent into madness could not compete with chainsaws and zombies. It vanished into obscurity with only imported copies circulating among collectors. Behind the scenes, Polanski's perfectionism bordered on madness. He built the entire apartment complex on a soundstage to control every shadow and echo. Crew members said the set itself felt cursed. The director reportedly lived in costume during filming, blurring his identity with the character. The atmosphere was so oppressive that several crew members quit mid-production. Rediscovered decades later, the tenant now feels prophetic. In an era of surveillance and identity crises, its horror feels more relevant than ever. It reminds us that sometimes the supernatural hides not in the dark, but within our reflection. The VHS era may have muted it, but its echo still reverberates through every story about isolation and loss of self. Number 4. The Haunting of Julia, 1977. Also known as Full Circle, this British-Canadian chiller starred Mia Farrow as a grieving mother who begins to believe her new home is haunted by the spirit of a murdered child. The film was quiet, poetic, and drenched in sorrow. It avoided jump scares, focusing instead on atmosphere and guilt. Critics praised its elegance, but audiences found it too subdued. When home video exploded, distributors chose louder films with blood and monsters. The Haunting of Julia vanished. For decades, it existed only in poor VHS transfers from European television broadcasts. Even fans of Mia Farrow's work barely knew it existed. The film's rights became tangled in international ownership disputes, making official releases impossible until the 21st century. Behind the scenes, Farrow gave one of her most delicate performances since Rosemary's Baby. The set was often silent between takes to preserve the mournful tone. Director Richard Loncraine filmed using natural light, creating ghostly shadows that made even daytime scenes feel spectral. Crew members swore that one unused reel developed strange discoloration resembling a child's face. Rediscovered and restored decades later, The Haunting of Julia became recognized as a lost gem of emotional horror. It proved that terror could be intimate, not grand. Watching it today feels like opening an old diary written by grief itself. The VHS era buried it beneath noise and gore, but time finally gave its ghost a voice. Number 3. The Brood, 1979. David Cronenberg's The Brood arrived at the end of the decade like a fever dream of rage and grief. It told the story of a woman undergoing experimental therapy who literally gives birth to physical manifestations of her anger, small deformed children who commit brutal murders on her behalf. The premise was shocking but deeply symbolic, exploring trauma and suppressed emotion with surgical precision. When it hit theaters, it frightened critics more than it entertained them. Some called it obscene, others called it genius. The studio marketed it as a monster film, but audiences were unprepared for its psychological depth. When the VHS market exploded, stores avoided it, fearing complaints about its disturbing imagery. The Brood was buried beneath safer titles like Friday the 13th, leaving its brilliance unseen. Behind the scenes, Cronenberg's own personal turmoil bled into the film. He was going through a painful divorce and poured his anguish into the script. Crew members later said the tension on set was palpable. Actress Samantha Eggar's harrowing performance in the film's finale was so intense that even Cronenberg admitted it unsettled him. The crew shot the climactic scene in near silence, no one daring to speak after the take. Years later, The Brood was recognized as one of Cronenberg's masterpieces. Its themes of psychological horror paved the way for films like Possession and Hereditary. Buried by the VHS era, it emerged as one of the most sophisticated explorations of human emotion ever disguised as horror. It taught audiences that the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create within ourselves. Number 2. Don't Look Now, 1973. Few films from the 1970s carried as much emotional weight and visual power as Don't Look Now. Starring Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, it told the story of a couple mourning their drowned daughter while living in Venice, where strange visions and murders intertwine. What began as a story about grief became a meditation on fate itself. Audiences were unsettled. Critics were divided between admiration and confusion. The dreamlike editing and disjointed timeline made it difficult for mainstream viewers. When the VHS era came, distributors trimmed key sequences to shorten runtime, dulling its impact. Some prints even removed the haunting final minutes, completely breaking the narrative's tragic rhythm. Behind the scenes, director Nicholas Roeg pushed his actors into emotional extremes. Venice's decaying beauty reflected their inner turmoil. The famous chase through the misty canals was filmed with almost no artificial lighting, making it feel like a dream captured on celluloid. Crew members reported hearing unexplained footsteps echoing through the empty alleys at night. Over time, Don't Look Now became recognized as a cinematic masterpiece cited by directors like Christopher Nolan and Ari Aster for its emotional storytelling. Yet for nearly 2 decades, it survived only in faded VHS transfers that failed to capture its color and texture. It remains a film about loss and vision, fittingly one that vanished from sight before being seen again. Number 1. The Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. At first glance, calling this sequel a classic might seem absurd. When it premiered, it was ridiculed as one of the worst sequels ever made. Yet buried beneath the chaos lies one of the most ambitious and misunderstood supernatural films of its decade. Director John Boorman sought not to repeat The Exorcist's terror, but to explore faith trauma and collective evil on a metaphysical scale. The story followed a priest investigating the aftermath of Reagan's possession, only to uncover a worldwide network of spiritual forces battling for control of humanity. It was visually stunning, with hypnotic soundscapes and experimental editing that felt years ahead of its time. But audiences wanted simple scares, not spiritual philosophy. The backlash was immediate. Warner Bros. Pulled it from theaters after just 2 weeks. When VHS took over the market, the film was avoided entirely. Rental stores viewed it as a punchline. Even horror magazines mocked it. But buried within that rejection was a visionary attempt to elevate horror to mythic proportions. Boorman's use of mirrored imagery, dream logic, and haunting African sequences gave it the texture of a fevered prophecy rather than a sequel. Behind the scenes, the production was plagued by tension and exhaustion. Linda Blair later admitted she barely understood the script. Yet decades later, film historians re-examined it as a bold experiment rather than a failure. The Exorcist II reminds us that history often buries its visionaries under ridicule until time resurrects their courage. From fog-drenched mansions to cursed reels lost under highways, these forgotten films haunt the edges of cinematic memory. Each was a spark of creativity smothered by the noise of the VHS boom, yet their ghosts remain. Which of these buried masterpieces will you dare to resurrect first? Watch them and listen closely, the past still whispers. Like, comment, and subscribe for more unearthed horror.